From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please sign up at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcast listening. Well, that was quite a couple of weeks. We jump off the news cycle for a short vacation and the world erupts. President Joe Biden announces he's standing down. The Democrats immediately install Kamala Harris in his place by acclamation. Tensions in the Middle East escalate to the point of near outright war. The economy trembles and the stock market shudders. All that and an Olympic opening ceremony of woke weirdness that only the French could manage. We'll have plenty of time in the next few weeks to talk about all of this. Well, maybe not the woke Olympics, but for now, I'm going to focus on the big news of this week until maybe something else blows up. And that is Kamala Harris's selection of her running mate for the presidential election. By now, of course, you'll all know it's Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota. Now, depending on whom you listen to, this selection is either a work of genius, certain to clinch the race for the Democrats, or a calamitous error that will send Donald Trump back to the White House. Now, vice presidential picks are rarely that important, but this year, given the unusual state of politics, who knows? Democrats and their media friends have already anointed Walz as the perfect candidate, the regular guy, former soldier, high school teacher, and football coach from the glorious heart of the country in the upper Midwest. He's mac and cheese and a trip to the hardware store, as a fawning Democrat put it on MSNBC. A salt of the earth American right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Republicans say, whoa, hold on. This is the governor who let Minnesota burn for 3 days during the riots that followed the George Floyd killing in 2020 because he didn't want to bring in the National Guard and he sympathized with the rioters' objectives. And his record on everything from taxes to cultural issues like transgender and abortion matters, they're right out of the far left playbook. So what is he really? And what does his selection, rather than that of Josh Shapiro, who had been seen as the frontrunner, the very popular governor of an actual swing state, but who also happens to be Jewish, what does all that say about Kamala Harris's Democratic Party? Well, to help answer this, I'm pleased to say I'm joined this week by two men who can offer some genuinely expert insight into both Governor Walz's record and experience in Minnesota and about the wider state of the presidential race. John Hinderaker is a lawyer and president of the Center for the American Experiment, a Minnesota-based public policy institution. He's a widely read commentator on U.S. politics and founded the very influential Powerline website. I'm also joined by Scott Johnson, who's a retired attorney in Minnesota, a contributor to Powerline, and who wrote a very interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today, that's Wednesday, dissecting Governor Tim Walz's record in Minnesota. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining Free Expression.
Thank you for having us.
Scott, let me start with you since you wrote the excellent piece in the Wall Street Journal today. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. I don't think it's unfair to Governor Tim Walz to say that he was kind of an unknown figure. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, his name was not familiar and wasn't really even apparently on the kind of what everybody was expecting to be the final shortlist for Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick. But she has picked him. You make this very strong case in the Journal about just how left-wing, I suppose, how progressive his record is. Tell us a little bit about him from your perspective, and what is it about him that you think makes him, in American political terms, so radical?
Well, I guess I'd start with his career in federal office in Minnesota. He served in a rural southern Minnesota district for 6 terms. I think he knocked off an incumbent Republican when he took office. And his current old district is held by a Republican now. And Walz has evolved in the Democratic fashion in office, and I'd put that in 2 stages. First, he won a Democratic primary in 2018 against the endorsed Democratic candidate. That isn't the usual course, but that's the way it went in 2018. He won when he went up against 2 strong liberal candidates who split the vote, and he kind of has this common man, moderate persona that had helped him win office in his district in southern Minnesota, and he prevailed in that Democratic primary with 41% of the vote. And he was elected against, I would say, a relatively weak Republican statewide candidate in that 2018 election. He won by 17 points. And his power until COVID hit was restrained by a small Republican majority in the state Senate. And I have to say, I felt like I was able to ignore state politics until COVID because nothing much happened. But as soon as COVID hit, and I mean within days, he declared a state of emergency on March 25, 2020, under an executive order 20-20, under which he exercised dictatorial power for 15 months. And it seemed to be the moment he was waiting for. And I was skeptical about his exercise of power at the time. I watched the video in which he declared the emergency and justified it on what turned out to be, I would say, false premises. But, listening to him, and as you see with his debut yesterday, he's got a kind of surface plausibility. But listening to him day after day for weeks on end during COVID, I found him to be a con man, a Joe Isuzu character, and somebody who loved the exercise of power, loved lording it over other people, loved dictating every corner of our lives. And when I go back and read the executive orders over those 15 months, as I recall, the emergency expired on July 1, 2021. And that was a fight. I don't think he gave it up willingly. He wanted to keep going.
John Hinderaker, Scott says there, the image that the Democrats have already been projecting about this governor is, look, he's a regular American guy. We've seen pictures of him, out hunting with his dog and his camo gear. He's a high school teacher. He's a high school football coach who took a winless team to great success. He's a typical American regular person. You can't possibly attack him for being an extremist. He's a military vet. He's got a resume that seems to suggest he is very much mainstream America. Is that all just sort of, as Scott kind of seems to imply, just superficial? What's your impression of him?
Well, that's completely superficial, Jerry. We can talk about Walz's policies in detail here. He is a far leftist on every issue. But I want to address specifically what you said there about the image that the Democrats are trying to project of Tim Walz. They're trying to present him, he's a small town guy. He's a small town guy and he's a veteran. And they think that he's going to appeal to rural voters, maybe some swing state rural voters. Well, the reality is that Tim Walz is despised in rural Minnesota. He was routed in rural Minnesota when he ran for re-election in 2022. And one of the reasons for that is that he is openly contemptuous of rural voters. He was caught on video telling some fellow Democrats they shouldn't worry about these big red swaths on the map, representing small town America, because what's there is mostly rocks and cows. That was the phrase he used. So a group of thousands of Minnesotans, Minnesota rocks and cows, started up and they put up anti-Walz billboards all across the state. They sold merchandise. And he's notorious in Minnesota for his contempt of rural voters. And as far as being a veteran, it is true that Tim Walz served in the Minnesota National Guard for 24 years and attained a high rank in the Guard. But in 2005, the Minnesota National Guard was deployed to Iraq. And instead of serving with his fellow guardsmen, Walz quit. He resigned rather than go to Iraq. And many of his former fellow guardsmen are still bitter about that to this day. So I think this veneer of being a regular guy, the small town moderate, the veteran, is very, very thin, and it's not going to survive scrutiny.
And it is true, isn't it? I looked at the results of both the 2018 and the 2022 gubernatorial election. Interestingly, he won in 2018 by about 11 percentage points and then won by a narrow margin in 2022. So it doesn't suggest he's kind of enjoying, he's really been a hugely successful incumbent there. But as you say also, John, looking at those counters, he won essentially by stacking up the Democratic vote in the big urban counties and lost massively in the rest of the state.
Yeah, that's right. The Democrats harvest enormous numbers of ballots out of Hennepin County in particular. And frankly, it's hard to overcome that on a statewide basis. Everybody thought the Republicans were going to do well in Minnesota in 2022, maybe not take the governorship, but do certainly well in the legislative races, some of the other races. Then the Dobbs decision came down, and the Democrats seized on that like a lifeline. And every Democrat running in 2022, including Tim Walz, all they talked about was abortion. So the 2022 election, in effect, became a referendum on abortion. And I think that's really the lens through which you have to look at those results.
Scott, first of all, he was rolled out yesterday. He did the big event in Philadelphia with Kamala Harris. A lot of people were actually quite impressed with him. Again, we'll get more into the details of his governing record and his record overall. But, the people did think he came across as, quite compelling. I saw it. He was quite fluent. He was quite funny. He came across as quite folksy. What did you make of that rollout?
It was a good production. It was well stage managed. We're living in such a bizarre period in which, this whole swapping out of the incumbent president who has won the votes to be renominated has occurred with our having very little idea of what is going on. And their production in Philadelphia yesterday, I thought, was very well done. He makes a good first impression. The point I was trying to make about his service in his old congressional district, he comes across well, but as governor, I would say his act wears thin. And remind me, in 2022, I think he won by 7 points by a smaller margin, maybe half of what he'd won in 2018. And I don't think he even carried his old district in the 2022 election. And that has to do both with the nature of the 4 years and particularly the one-man rule of COVID and the George Floyd riots and all the rest that he has presided over. But also, you begin to see through his act. And he's got this glorified salesman thing that, has a surface plausibility at the beginning and then we're very thin.
He was picked, John, to run for Congress back in 2006, and you just given the background about how he left the National Guard at that point to run for Congress. But he was part of that intake, successful Democratic field in 2006, assembled by Rahm Emanuel, I think particularly. He was trying to get electable candidates with strong kind of mainstream resumes. And again, a lot of military, a lot of people who'd done public service. And he did win, and he won a previously Republican-held seat. I'm wondering, was he always this pretty radical, progressive figure? Or do you think he, like many people in the Democratic Party, have maybe moved to the left as the party has moved left? What's your sense of the trajectory of his political career?
Well, I think he's always been on the left. I think that in recent years, the left has moved left, so that, in the last few years, he's mandated tampon dispensers in all of the boys' bathrooms in public schools in Minnesota. He's got abortion up to and including the moment of birth. He's got legislation that makes Minnesota a trans refuge state so that minors can come here and have sex change operations that would be illegal where they live. Now, some of these things were not on the horizon. You know what I mean? He certainly was not advocating things like that when he was running for Congress in the 1st District. But I think he's always been on the left, and I think that the Democrats have been racing to the left in recent years, and Tim Walz has been right there.
Let's talk about some other aspects of his record, again, which we've already touched on. But one story that got a lot of attention, and I think is probably I hope is going to get some more attention if the press are going to do their job, was the level of COVID free. You've already talked about COVID, Scott, and how draconian he was in terms of lockdowns and things like that. But we also had the COVID fraud that seems to have been worse in Minnesota. And there was various studies have been done and various hearings have been done, which have actually cast some criticism and responsibility onto the state government. Tell us a little bit about how bad this COVID fraud was and what exactly Tim Walz's role was in it.
Well, Gerry, when it comes to COVID fraud, we're number one. And the COVID fraud occurred under the auspices of the state of Minnesota in general and the Minnesota Department of Education, led by a Walz appointee in particular, that administered one of these COVID food programs. I would say a lady named Amy Bach found a seam in the program in which you could start filing vouchers for reimbursement under this program without having to show much in the way of evidence that the goods had been delivered, if lunches had been served or whatever. And she started recruiting Somalis from around the Twin Cities metropolitan area to use their nonprofits or establish nonprofits and start filing claims for reimbursement of these programs. The FBI got onto it, was tipped by the Minnesota Department of Education, which continued to dole out money to such an extent that as of today, we think at least $250 million went out the door for mythical lunches and meals. And the United States Attorney took the case to a grand jury and secured 70 indictments against the participants who were administering this program in these various nonprofits led by Amy Bach, who led a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future. So we call it the Feeding Our Future fraud. But she has yet to be tried. She's pleaded not guilty, but she was the ringleader of this operation. This is a huge case. The first case involved 7 defendants. 18 of these 70 have pleaded guilty, but the first case that went to trial in late April involved 7 defendants who participated in the program. The fraud is so gross. 5 of the defendants were convicted. 2 were acquitted. One of the ones who was acquitted has since been indicted for bribing a juror who fortunately called the police when $100,000 in cash was dropped off at her home just before the jury was set to begin deliberations. What is Walz's participation? Well, he went into Joe Isuzu mode. It wasn't his fault. According to him, a state district court judge made his Department of Education keep the money flowing. And what Walz said was so false that the court issued a press release refuting Walz's attempt to cast blame on the court. And I quote that in my column that's in the Journal today. But it's really an extraordinary set of circumstances. Actually, let me just say that this case of the 7 defendants is the biggest federal criminal case that's ever been tried in Minnesota. And there are, another 50 in line to go, including the ringleader. And the case that's taking preeminence is the bribery case involving 3 defendants, 2 of whom were in this original case.
And John, of course, something else we're all very familiar with. Minnesota was ground zero for the riots in the summer of 2020. The killing of George Floyd, of course, happened in Minnesota. Tell us a bit about that and about the governor's response to that, because again, there's been a lot of reporting on this, and some of it, I think, attempts to kind of clear Walz of any responsibility. Take us through that, if you would, what Walz's response was in those days after the killing when Minnesota was in a state of absolute chaos.
Right. So the rioting began not long after George Floyd's death, and it went on and it got worse and worse. The rioters burned down many buildings. They burned down a 6-story building that was under construction. They stormed and burned and destroyed the Minneapolis Police Department's 3rd Precinct station house. They completely destroyed about a 2-mile stretch of Lake Street in Minneapolis, as well as other areas of the city, and also St. Paul and some other places. Well, this went on for days. And for 4 days, Tim Walz didn't do much of anything. And people were pleading with him to call out the National Guard to try to put a stop to the riots. And he refused to do it until finally, after 4 nights of rioting, he finally broke down and called the National Guard out. And that put a stop to the rioting pretty quickly. But the damage was done, and not only done in Minneapolis, but it spread to other cities around the country. And I think that was due in large part to Tim Walz's ineffective response. And he himself acknowledged that his reluctance to really suppress the riots had to do with the fact that he was sympathetic to the cause of the rioters.
Was he on the record about being sympathetic?
I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but he has a couple of times said, I was kind of with them. And those riots were a turning point in Minnesota history because they triggered a crime spree that has not ended to this day. Historically, you can go back as far as you want. Minnesota was always a low crime state. Always. That's not true anymore. Now, for the first time in history, the per capita rate of serious crime in Minnesota, that's Part 1 crimes as defined by the FBI, is now higher than the national average. So as a direct result of Tim Walz's policies, not only during the riots, but his anti-law enforcement positions generally, has directly led to Minnesota now for the first time officially being a high crime state.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, we'll have more on the record and standing and political ideology of Tim Walz, the new Democratic nominee for vice president, with 2 guests who know him very well, Scott Johnson and John Hinderaker. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. We're talking about Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, and of course the nominee for the Democratic Party for vice president. And I'm talking about him with 2 people who know him well, Scott Johnson, who's a retired attorney in Minnesota, and John Hinderaker, president of the Center for the American Experiment, and also the founder of the influential Powerline website. Scott, let's briefly talk about the economy there too. Again, you mentioned in your Wall Street Journal op-ed the fiscal position that Minnesota's had, the economic performance overall, where you say Minnesota's fallen from relatively above average for the U.S. economic performance. Give us that. I mean, Walz has been governor now for 6 years. Tell us about his economic record.
Gerry, I have to say I relied for that introductory paragraph on data compiled by John's organization, the Center of the American experiment. So I'd like to defer to him, but I just wanted to say with respect to the last point you raised, there's kind of a crossover between the era of one-man rule and the riots that Walz presided over. Incidentally, they didn't just spread to other cities in the United States, of course. They also spread to St. Paul and suburban areas of the Twin Cities. Lake Street continues across a bridge to Marshall Avenue in St. Paul, and if you turn left at Snelling, you end up at University and Snelling in the city of St. Paul, and those blocks on both sides of University Avenue were torched. Just unbelievable. And out in the suburban areas where John and I live, I went shopping on that Sunday morning, and the Target in Eagan was boarded up. The windows had been hacked out, and the courthouse in Dakota County suffered a brick going through the window and so on. This stuff went on for days and did, at the end of the day, at least $500 million in property damage, which is a lot of damage in an urban setting. With respect to COVID, I just wanted to say, Walz, he dictated every corner of our lives, and whether you could go to church, whether you could hold a funeral, whether you could visit a parent in a nursing home and so on. But when it came to George Floyd, I don't know if you remember, the televised funeral of George Floyd was during this era of one-man rule in which Walz had mandated 6-foot social distancing among people in public places and no congregations in churches, that's for sure. But the funeral of George Floyd was a massive church event for the ages, with a whole parade of people.
John, if you would, as Scott's deferred to you, give us a picture of the economic record of Walz.
Sure. So Minnesota, again, has historically been a relatively prosperous state. And the simplest measure of that is per capita gross domestic product. That's the basic measure of economic well-being. And Minnesota's per capita GDP has always been above the national average until now. But we are a high-tax state. We've become a higher tax under Tim Walz. Walz is anti-business, anti-growth. And in 2023, for the first time ever, per capita GDP in Minnesota is now below the national average. It's really kind of stunning. Tim Walz took a prosperous state and he has turned it into a below-average state economically.
So look, you painted this incredible picture, to be honest, of, state. Let me just summarize it. Subpar economic performance with challenges, creating real serious fiscal difficulties, an authoritarian, as you've described him, and some of the most authoritarian measures we saw during COVID, oversaw a system that ended up producing the greatest COVID fraud in the country, very radical on trans issues and abortion, rising crime, a state that, have relatively low levels of crime previously, now has high crime. Again, I'm trying to be fair here, but this is an incredibly bleak picture you paint. Is there anything at all that Tim Walz has done? Do the buses run on time or something? Or has we got a good traffic system in Minneapolis and Paul? What do his defenders say about his record as governor?
Well, it's hard to say. They don't talk much about his record. They don't talk about the data. They smear Republicans and they love to talk about abortion, but they don't talk about crime and the economy. There's a lot more education. If you want to, we can talk about that. It's been a disaster in the public schools under Tim Walz. And I think, when you look at his record and you say, well, how in the heck did he get elected and re-elected? I think you need a little context there, because in Minnesota, there is a real structural imbalance between the parties. We have a much stronger Democratic Party than Republican Party, and we have enormous amounts of money that flow into this state, not for Republicans, but for Democrats. They get most of their money from outside of the state of Minnesota. And as a result of those kind of structural factors, no Republican has won a statewide race in Minnesota since 2006. Democrats have won something like 30 statewide races in a row. So in that context, it isn't really a shock that a guy like Tim Walz, unimpressive though he may be, if he can get the nomination of the DFL party, he can get elected. And I will say, too, Gerry, that I'm kind of glad he got this nomination in a way, not for the sake of America. I certainly hope he is never our vice president. But I do think that a light is now being shown on his record on the national scene in a way that it really hasn't been even on the Minnesota scene.
Well, good luck to you, because the lieutenant governor looks even more radical, right? So
Yeah, right, exactly.
Enjoy those consequences. Scott, sorry, you were going to say something.
I'm sorry to have interrupted. I was just going to say one prong of his success in Minnesota is that he's received the kind of press that Kamala Harris is receiving right now from the national press. And I don't hold out hope that they're going to do better with Tim Walz. But, when he's talking about what does he have going for him on the other side, in that legislature that was elected in 2018, it ended up with an $18 billion surplus that John noted was spent, but it wasn't spent. None of it went back to the taxpayers, which has really not been our tradition. None of it was returned to taxpayers. In 2022, the Democrats took over both bodies of the state legislature, and it was like in the old Prince song, "Let's Go Crazy." They spent it all. They have built in more spending programs. And if you talk to Democrats or listen to Democrats who enthuse about Walz, it's the expansion of the welfare state that is main stock in trade.
So as the Republicans, and it's fair to say at the moment the Republican campaign seems to be a little discombobulated. I think it's fair to put it at a minimum over the events of the last few weeks. So now we have Tim Walz. It does look as though, again, given the alternatives, particularly Josh Shapiro, which everybody until about 3 days ago thinking seemed inevitable. As Republicans look at this now, perhaps with a renewed sense of eagerness at the race, you've laid out obviously all the grounds on which Walz should be criticized and his record examined. If you were advising Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and his campaign, so it seems a pretty target-rich environment. What would be the central message that you would use, John, to go after Governor Walz?
In some ways, he's an easy man to mock. I mean, somebody on TV started calling him Tampon Tim, over the tampon dispensers in the boys' bathrooms. But what I would say is that his record is so bad, but it's also similar to the Biden-Harris record. And one of the reasons why the Democrats swapped out Biden and replaced him with Harris, Biden was probably just beyond being able to run. But in addition to that, they're trying to walk away from Biden's record and get kind of a fresh start with Kamala, even though she was the vice president for the last 4 years. And if I were running the Republicans' campaigns, I would resist the temptation for some of the cheaper shots at Tim Walz. And what I would do with Tim Walz is to tie him into Kamala Harris and the Biden-Harris administration, because they are two perfect exemplars of the failure of liberal policies. And I think that is really the winning message in this election.
Scott, that said, I did note one of the things that's being said in his defense, or at least in criticism of Trump and the Republicans, is that Trump did appoint him, I think, to his National Governors Advisory Council when Trump was president. Can Trump and Vance effectively go after Walz in the way that we've talked about?
Well, I think Harris has to be target number one, and I wish they would focus their criticism on her and the Biden administration programs that she should be held to defend. Walz can be connected to them all, as John says. The best example, I think, is illegal immigration. Walz is a great supporter of it. He's helped the legislature get into law the driver's licenses for illegals and therefore facilitate illegal voting and all the rest. But it seems to me, I wish that the Trump campaign were disciplined enough to focus on the record of Vice President Harris in the Biden administration. And I think that's the case they have to make. And when they talk about going back, this theme of going back that they had at the Philadelphia rally yesterday, I thought people kind of wanted to go back to the economic growth of the Trump administration and how everyone's incomes were raised because there was no inflation and there was economic growth. And it seems to me like that whole aspect of the campaign has been missed so far.
John, if you're right, and this governor's record is really as frankly as terrible as it is, and he is politically as extreme as he seems, I'll ask this question both from a kind of an objective but also a subjective point of view, i.e. objectively, if you like, from the voters or the Democrats' point of view, but also from your point of view. Why do you think Kamala Harris picked him? How did he suddenly come from, again, this sort of fair obscurity, to be honest, but also, as we now know, as you've described, with this record that is highly, highly challengeable? Why do you think that he got the nod?
Well, I think it was by default. I think they started out with a list of potential vice presidential nominees, and he was on it. He's currently the president of the Democratic Governors Association and has gotten to be a little bit well known in Washington. He was on the list. And one by one, they started to fall. Mark Kelly of Arizona was a favorite at one time. And then it came out that he had this spy satellite company he was involved in with the Chinese. And I think that put him out of business. And then it looked like it was going to be Josh Shapiro. And I believe, I speculate, but I believe that Kamala Harris had decided to offer the vice presidential position to Josh Shapiro. And that's why they had the rally yesterday in Philadelphia. They didn't have it in Minneapolis. They had it in Philadelphia. And Shapiro ran into sharp opposition from the anti-Semitic progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is very strong in that party. And just a few days ago, it came out that when he was a college student, Shapiro had written an essay, I think in a college newspaper or something, where he not only was pro-Israel, which I think he could have gotten away with, but he also criticized the Palestinians. And progressive Twitter went crazy over this. The hashtag genocide Josh, was all over Twitter. It's just disgusting. It's terrible. My reading of the events is that in the end, the opposition to Shapiro from the anti-Semitic wing of the Democratic Party was so strong that Kamala Harris felt that she had to make a change. And at that point, there was only one other guy still standing, and it was Tim Walz.
You mentioned Josh Shapiro, and it is said, and I've seen some of the quotes from Walz, but you know it better, that Walz is every bit as pro-Israel as Shapiro is. Is that right, do you think? Or what's your sense of, so far as he has a view on it, what's your sense of where he stands, either of you?
Scott, what do you think? I don't remember Walz saying much about the Middle East.
It's funny. The first time I saw him speak was in his first few years in Congress, and it was at a ceremony held by the Jewish Community Relations Council in Minneapolis, and he was there as a supporter of Israel. But I think his views have evolved. I think he's perfectly in sync with Kamala Harris. I have yet to hear what Josh Shapiro has to say about current events in the Middle East. His views may have evolved too, and I have no doubt he would have fallen into line if she would only have gone with them, and people like me would have felt like it's a disgrace for the Jewish people to see that happen. But it didn't happen, and I think Walz is going to be perfectly in sync with her.
We've talked about a lot, obviously, about Walz for obvious reasons. As you both said, that Harris is the presidential candidate, the vice presidential candidate in the end, probably rarely makes much difference. But do you think there is any sense in which this pick could turn out to be a big problem for Harris? Or, putting it from the other side, is this an opportunity for Republicans to really, by tying Walz so closely to Harris, as you've said before, to the Harris-Biden administration, that this is one of those vice presidential picks that could, in a close election, make a difference? Scott, you first.
I would guess he's going to have the traditional role and not do anything negative or positive for her. But that's just a guess. If the press did its job, I think people would be interested. But I don't think the press will do its job. I'd be curious what you think about that, Jerry. And I just want to say on this question of a bad record, Walz has a bad record with respect to the conventional metrics that John's organization has compiled and that I cite in the Journal column today. But it's beyond that. It's really a horrible record. He's presided over a destruction of a vast swath of the Twin Cities and the biggest COVID fraud in the United States. It goes beyond being, what you might refer to as a bad record.
John, your thoughts finally, but I will just say that to your point, Scott, I'm very doubtful that the press will dig deeply into Tim Walz's Minnesota record. I hope I'm proved wrong, but I have my doubts. But last word to you, John, on whether or not this really makes any difference to the election.
Probably not. I don't think Walz will hurt her. By rights, he should. But a couple of things. One, he's a kind of a mean-spirited, vicious guy. He's very well suited to the traditional attack dog role of the vice presidential nominee. I think he'll do that relatively well. And like Scott said, he's Joe Isuzu. He's got the salesman thing going, and he's only got to have people put up with him for about 90 days, right? And so he probably can last that long before his welcome wears thin. So I don't think it's likely, unless something comes out that we don't now know about, I don't think it's likely that he'll be a drag on the ticket, nor do I think he will do her any perceptible good.
All right, John Hinderaker, Scott Johnson, thank you both for educating me and my listeners on the eye-opening record of Governor Tim Walz, now the official Democratic nominee for vice president. Thank you both for joining Free Expression.
Thank you, Jerry. Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Doubtless many, many things will happen between now and the next time I speak to you, but thanks again. We'll be back again next week. Looking forward to dissecting some other aspect of the news. In the meantime, have a great week. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.